I wonder if you might help me start this morning by standing as I read our text for today, which is John chapter 3, beginning in verse 22. After this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. John also was baptizing at Aenon near Salim because water was plentiful there, and people were coming and being baptized, for John had not yet been put in prison. Now, or literally therefore, a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew over purification. And they came to John and said to him, "Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing, and all are going to him." John answered, "A person cannot receive even one thing, unless it is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, but I must decrease." You may be seated. Two weeks ago, just about now, I was trying to sit. I say trying because I had intense back pain that made it hard to walk or sit or come to church. So I was home, and thank you for praying for me if you heard about that. But it didn't keep me from praying for you guys who were here gathering to hear Nate talk about, what Jesus said to Nicodemus. And it didn't prevent me from thinking about what I would be preaching here 2 weeks later, right about now. So as I was relaxing at home, the question that kept niggling me was this. Why would anyone want to listen to a sermon on John 3, 22 to 30 when they could stay home in bed and relax? Why would anyone actually be glad that they had crawled out of their warm blankets on a miserable morning like today, mid-November weather, and come here, and that is you really could have relaxed. You could have stayed home even without the interruption of a Seahawks game, since this is a bye week. And then I asked, why would someone choose to hear a whole sermon on something that they already know without any argument, that John the Baptist is a fan of Jesus Christ? Really? I mean, we already learned that in chapter 1, if we didn't know it already. And that's like sacrificing a good night's sleep for a chance to hear that Billy Graham was not a fan of the devil. So why would you do that? I would not. But as I thought through the passage, a different reason for hearing this sermon came to me, something besides mere information or repetition. And I reasoned that if the Apostle John knew mountains of things about Jesus that he chose to omit, which he tells us in chapter 20 and 21, there were many other signs he did, and he says, hey, all the books could not even contain everything you could write about what Jesus said and did and thought and whatever. Well, John is being extremely selective, so what occurred to me is that there's got to be a very, very good reason why he would bring in John the Baptizer again in chapter 3, something besides what we had already learned in chapter 1. Because in chapter 1, there was plenty from the baptizer about Jesus' importance, supremacy, and how he admired him. So here's what struck me. We should kick off our covers and come here to listen to this passage because of a pitched battle that we all face. And it's the battle with miserable pride. This passage ends with these powerful words, "He must increase, but I must decrease." And I call this miserable pride because there are two intertwined themes that poke at us throughout this passage, and they're summarized in the last statement that John makes. Joy and humility. Joy, that's the he must increase side, and humility, that's the I must decrease side. Now, a huge benefit of this passage, then, is that it provides critical ammunition for this battle, this battle against self-centered, joy-killing, ambition that we all detest on one level, but we have to admit we struggle to vanquish in any convincing way. And I mean within ourselves. I mean within all of us. I mean within even the most humble person here. We all need help, and all the help we can get. So what do we have to do to wound and subdue this monster in our heart, this sin of all devils? Now, we should see this as a desperate thing, and we find out why in this passage, because this monster of pride interferes with our ability to exalt and enjoy Jesus Christ. And the lack of that produces almost all the bad things that happen to us, including all the damage to our relationships, such as our families and our marriages. And so I want to talk about that just a little bit. How does that happen? Think about pride. Pride fuels our anger and resentments, our impatience with our spouse and kids, or impatience with our parents or our siblings. It is this pride monster that forces others to walk on eggs around us. It deepens our discontent, gives us a grumbling spirit. It drives our competitiveness and our jealousies. It craves attention. It fishes for compliments. It hates criticism. It generates arguments where we're more concerned not about what's right, but about who's right. It incubates face-saving lies and defensiveness. It's the pride monster that demands our rights and ignores our wrongs. It easily gets offended by innocent trifles. It holds on to hurts and offenses, so there's little forgiveness, but lots of naming, blaming, and shaming, and even defaming. It manufactures excuses for our sins while exaggerating the sins of others. Makes it so hard to apologize, even on those times when we even admit that we've been wrong. It breeds stubbornness that creates deadlocks. I don't know if this sounds like anyone in your family. Maybe you. It's this sin monster that makes us grouchy when things don't go the way we want. Breeds ingratitude because we imagine we became so great without anyone's help. It breeds bitterness when we think those that could have helped us become great neglected us or tore us down instead. It manipulates others, and intimidates instead of communicates. It inspires us to want to control other people and to get very resentful when they don't like it, or when they try to control us. It stirs up boasting in us, our photoshopped lives, while demeaning and putting others down. It quenches our praying, because pride makes us unaware of how much we need God. It stifles our compassion. It produces coldness toward the needs of others. It prioritizes comfort over sacrifice and pleasing ourselves over serving others. It elevates our opinions to the level of absolutes, which makes us unteachable and unapproachable. It can make us talk too much or talk too little, make us think too much of ourselves or too little of ourselves. It's the father of all hypocrisy, smugness, and false humility. And all these things wreck families and marriages and every relationship and whole churches. And on top of these, our selfish pride shuts our mouths when we ought to speak up for Jesus, worried what people will think of us. It makes us complacent to the fact that 2 billion people do not have enough gospel to be saved, but we're fine with that as long as we have Jesus. Tempts us to mock and avoid people who aren't enough like us. And so we get racism and tribalism of all sorts. It makes us feel entitled and deserving, and therefore robs God of his rightful glory because of sheer grace. And above all, it invites the resistance of God, who gives grace only to the humble. Are you happy with all that? No, you are not. In fact, you hate all of that, and you especially hate it when proud people are like that toward you. All of these things are lacerations of soul. They're inflicted by our own hand. The people in our family who are most like this are invariably the unhappiest, but it afflicts us all. Our pride leaves us limping along with a low-grade unhappiness that God never wanted for us, but we are very much too used to. We hardly know how unhappy we are. God wants it to stop, and we must learn how that can happen. And so we must lay hold in earnest as we listen to this passage today on what God has provided for the slaying of our inwardly focused, joy-crushing ambition, and on what God has provided for the igniting of an outwardly focused, pride-slaying, self-forgetful, servant-hearted, sacrifice-welcoming, Christ-promoting delight. This passage in John opens up all of that. Do you want to hear how that goes? You want to hear that? Well, buckle up. We've read the passage. You know this comes in two parts. We read it in two parts. The first part, verses 22 to 26, ends with jealous disciples complaining to their master, "Look, all are going to Jesus. Isn't this terrible?" And the second part, verses 27 to 30, ends with a joyful John rebutting his disciples with this: He must increase, but I must decrease. Isn't this terrific? So we start with verses 22 to 24. Now, this all happens after the things that happened in Jerusalem. It says after this. And you remember what happened in Jerusalem, the whip in the temple and the miracles that attracted a substantial but pretty superficial following. And then that amazing nighttime chat between Jesus and Nicodemus. And then John 3:16. Well, John, he's our old evangelist. He's writing all this down. He's an old man. But he sets the scene in the first verse with something that he had witnessed firsthand. He went along with the other disciples and with Jesus into the countryside of Judea, and there they carried on a ministry that included baptism. Now, they had previously been, John and probably all the other disciples had been students or disciples of the other John, but they had switched over to Jesus. But not all the baptizer's disciples had done so. Now, we're never told why they didn't. We just learned here that there were new people coming to John, and there were these disciples, and so we have two overlapping bands of baptizers. I say bands of baptizers because we're told in chapter 4, verse 2, that Jesus actually didn't personally do any baptizing, but his disciples did, and I suspect that was the same for John the Baptist. And by the way, only the fourth gospel tells us anything about this. In fact, without this gospel, we would not know anything about the first year of Christ's ministry before John was arrested. Well, this overlap seems to occur last for maybe 6 months before the baptizer gets tossed into prison by Herod the Tetrarch, and then some more time elapses until Herod detaches John's head at the whim of his resentful wife and her dancing daughter. And then, well, a lot of this we learn in these three verses here in John chapter 3. And the baptizer's life will end before we get to chapter 6 without notice. Well, this overlap creates some confusion for the baptizer's disciples. The tension of this passage results from the radically different way that John's devoted disciples react to certain information and the way their Rabbi John reacts to the same set of facts. Let's find out what they are. Let's go to verse 25. Now, or actually it should be translated therefore. If you've got a New American Standard Bible, it translates it literally, and it should be therefore. Verse 25 then informs us that these parallel ministries, overlapping bands of disciples working and not far from each other actually, that this sparked a dispute of some kind, a discussion. So a discussion or an argument, a questioning arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew over purification. It explains none of what that dispute was about. We could only guess what that was, but for some reason, evidently, this Jew brings up the idea that Jesus and his guys were baptizing people also. And so, at this point, this is something that John's disciples didn't know, and John didn't know either. And so they get concerned about this, and they go to John. What is John going to think when they tell him? Is he going to feel like Jesus is doing the right thing or not? Or, is he breaking a non-compete agreement, or what's happening here? Is Jesus a sheep stealer? And so in verse 26 it says, they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness. Now let's stop right there. They're obviously talking about Jesus, although they never name him for some reason. But they're saying, look, how much you did for him. You bore witness about him. You got him started in his ministry. You were so deferring to him. And now this, look, he is baptizing. This guy, and the way they share this, it's obvious that they're informing something of John that they think is going to either shock him some way or concern him, but they say he's baptizing. He's like stealing your brand. You're the baptizer, not him. You can have Jesus the Baptist. So how dare he? This is like copyright infringement, or China stealing U.S. technology, or pirating software, or ripping off Taylor Swift tunes. But worse yet, and here's the most important part, the very end of the paragraph, and all are going to him. And that is the real point of the first 5 verses. It sets everything up for what follows. All are going to him. Now, their concern was not so much that the other team was baptizing, but that they were getting much bigger crowds than their guy. Now, you think that this information might thrill John's disciples, but no, you know they're not thrilled because of how they exaggerate. We already know that other people were still coming to John, but not in great numbers. You know, the tide is turning. And so when they say all are going to him, that is the way you talk when you're resentful or jealous, or maybe even angry or hurt or, humiliated, or maybe even panicked. All our old customers are wearing Jesus hats. John's disciples are disturbed. And in the back of their minds, you can imagine, they might wonder if they have put their money on the wrong horse. They don't want that to be true. Rabbi, please tell us it isn't so. We didn't make a mistake, did we? This is a competition, and we're losing. Now, don't think you might have been there and reacted a different way. Reflect on how heady it was for these guys to be linked with John in his heyday. Everyone in Israel knows who John is. In fact, is highly respected by people from all levels. It's like he's on the news every night. You know, crowds stream to him to hear him preach. And these guys are his right-hand men. If he's in the camera shot, they're standing right there, you know, holding up his, well, he didn't wear a robe, he had a leather belt and whatever. Anyway, they were in the scene, and they were pretty happy to be so. Lieutenants of the most fascinating man in the land. It's had to be magical for these guys, whose lives up till now had been, I suppose, all dust and drab compared to this. Well, they could get no joy out of the preeminence of Jesus. So they need to find out, what does John think about this? Is he ticked? Is he jealous? Is he discouraged? Will he quit? It doesn't cross their mind that this news might make him outrageously happy. What follows is a monument to the humility of the man that Jesus will later eulogize as the greatest man born of woman. John's father, Zacharias, was told by an angel before John was born that his son would be great before the Lord. And now we see what true greatness looks like. What we get now is the greatest discipleship lesson that anyone could ever receive, including us. And what a great joy it had to be for John to instill in his disciples the humbling and glorious power of an eternal delight in Jesus Christ. So if the title of the first paragraph is jealousy, the title of these last verses must be joy. There are 4 verses and 4 parts to John's rebuttal. This prophet, named John, completely contradicts the reaction of his men, but without rebuking them directly. I mean, he had to be a little bit flattered about, that they were so loyal, and a little pumped up that he had men that were jealous for his prestige, but if it did, he did not let that nudge him 1 millimeter off of the joy that he had demonstrated ever since he first encountered Jesus. And you know when that was. Their first meeting was not at the Jordan River, but in utero. Luke chapter 1, John was 6 months older, still not born, and when the pregnant Mary visited the very pregnant Elizabeth, who was John's mother, we get the very first worship honoring the arriving Messiah. John leaps in his mother's womb, leaps for joy, it says. And it was God giving the unborn prophet the gift of joy in the presence of Jesus. Now let me say right here that John becomes the poster prophet for, do we have those? Poster prophet for the previous verses of John 3. Let me kind of glue all this together and why this is given to us at this point. You remember the verses that we've just covered about God loving the world, sending his son so that people that believe in him can have eternal life. But sadly, John goes on to say, people hate the light of Christ and prefer the darkness that allows them to hide their sins. Sinners hate to be exposed. And so, how is it that anyone comes to the light? Well, it's because God has birthed them. New birth. The Spirit blowing like an unseen wind to plant life in light-hating sinners. so that they can see and love the light of Christ. Love it. Love Him. As in delight in every glimpse of Him. To leap for joy when they can't even see Him. To want to be around Him, even if that means being exposed. And how do they get to that? Rather than continue in their hiding, in their hatred. Well, the verse right before our passage, of which John is such a great example, having rejoiced in Jesus from before He was born, it is this: but whoever does what is true comes to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. So if you see a light lover like the baptizer, then you know that God has done a work within that person so that they are able to love and delight in Jesus. That is what it's all about. As Leon Morris puts it as he's thinking about these verses, he says, it is only the man on whom God has laid His hand who can truly say that his works are wrought in God. So if people are leaving John, so here's John. This explains how he is the man he is. And it also explains why people are going to Jesus. Because if they leave John, they go to Jesus, then God is doing that. God is giving them to the Son of His love, as we'll see later, as His bride, to this one in whom He is well pleased. John is the first and fiercest fan of all of that. Now we look at how the baptizer explains his joyful heart to his jealous disciples in these verses. So I say 4 verses, 4 parts: a principle, a reminder, an analogy, and then fourth, a resolution. We start with this, verse 27. Here the baptizer starts with a basic principle that should silence all comparisons, all resentments. John answered, a person is not able to receive even one thing, well, not one smidgen of anything, any faith, any success, any influence, anything, unless it is given. Given, like a gift, like a sovereign gift from God, from heaven. So there's no competition here between John and Jesus. This is God at work. If they're different, or if they're the same, or if one is successful or not, that's God. Now, I think by far the bigger point for the baptizer, as far as his men are concerned, is that they would know that Jesus was succeeding because this was just God's plan. This is what God wanted. How do you guys think he's getting big crowds? Is he cheating somehow? Is he ripping off our baptism piece? Well, the place of Christ, whether large or small, is a gift from heaven. Now look, Jesus could not have acquired even one follower apart from God's will. It is the work of God, fitted into the context. In the same way as our salvation, if people come to Jesus, God is at work drawing them to Jesus, and the success of Jesus is a gift from God. So that's where we start. And that, in verse 27, by itself is enough to clear up all confusion in the minds of John's disciples. All the jealousy should just go away. Just pack up and leave under the sovereignty of God, which humbles us before whatever God wants to do. Now, where does the joy part come from? Well, hang on to that. We've got something else to do before that. The second thing has to do with a reminder. Now, before the baptizer gets to the joy part, he applies the principle to himself. In verse 28, he contrasts the two roles, his own role and that of Jesus, a contrast that establishes which of the two should be expected to be more prominent. And so it's not that there are two separate but equal ministries that God has given, but that one was always intended to be greater than the other. So I call this a reminder because he is telling his guys, hey, remember what I taught you before. And this should have prevented them from being so surprised. You yourselves bear me witness. Right now, you could tell me what I said then. What did I say? I said this: I am not the Christ, the Messiah. I've never claimed to be the Messiah. You know that. You could tell me that right now. But in sharp contrast, I have been sent by somebody better than me, before him, ahead of him. Implication, I'm preparing the way. I was sent ahead to point everybody to him. And so if people are running to Jesus in greater numbers, that only proves I've been doing my job. But my job is going to be going less, and his is going more. It's all implied in these words. So this was always God's plan. I get some people, and then I give them up. I never was the Messiah. I just stepped onto the stage first so I could introduce Jesus to the world. As Messiah, I have my very wonderful role as a forerunner, but that doesn't make me above Jesus. I might have got here first, but I am not in first place. So guys, wipe the frowns off your faces. And in fact, I love what God gave me. This is pure joy. And now let me give you a short analogy that explains my heart. And now we get to the wedding part. So almost like a little parable. The characters in the wedding, how do they react and interact? This beautifully illustrates John's relationship to Jesus. You guys have been to weddings, right? So there's roles here. I've got to talk to the guys here. The women all know this. There's going to be a groom and a bride, obviously, but there's also a best man. Now, weddings in that day were a little different, and none of those differences really are needed to understand John's point here, except one. The best man was the one who actually got to hand off the bride to the groom, what the father of the bride would do in our weddings. And the main point here is plain old joy. And so he writes in verse 29, recounting what John said, the one who has the bride. And we could stop for a long time on the word has. Jesus has the bride. So when the one who has the bride, and the bride, of course, would be the crowds of people that believe and follow Jesus. You're aware that God's people are called the bride of Christ. Even in the Old Testament, we get this bride idea in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea. So the one who has the bride is the bridegroom. Now, he doesn't identify him. He's just kind of leaving it there because he really wants to not take away from the main point that we'll get to in a little bit. So the one who has the bride is the bridegroom. That's Jesus. The friend of the bridegroom, that's the best man, that would be who? John the Baptist. So he says that the friend of the bridegroom stands and hears him. So imagine a best man near the groom during the joyful festivities that he has helped to organize, standing nearby and then hearing his friend's words of joy over his bride. And it says that he rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. So stop right there. And so he's talking to his guys. Are they getting this at all? So these guys are jealous and upset because Jesus has more people than John. And he's saying, you see all the cameras flashing his direction. You see the rice flying that way. You see all the honeymoon excitement going that way. And you think I should be sitting on the steps back at the church moping. No, I am thrilled. To make Jesus happy is why I get up every morning, why I put on my scratchy old camel shirt and have my honey bunches of crickets. This is why I live. I hear his voice. No, okay, I was the voice crying in the wilderness. You remember that? But this is a voice. The voice that should thrill us all. It is the voice of the true shepherd that Jesus is going to teach about in chapter 10, the true shepherd. And the sheep follow him because they know his voice. And all the people are going to him. Come on, guys, rejoice. If Jesus is happy, what more could you want? And so in unmistakable language, he gives you the point of this whole analogy. Therefore, this joy of mine as the best man of Jesus Christ is now complete. It is full to the very brim. I could not possibly be happier. And so the news that you guys just brought to me, which I didn't know, that Jesus is baptizing and everybody's going to him, I was wanting to hear this my whole life from the very beginning. First time I leaped in my mother's womb. Jesus is getting his bride, and now I couldn't be happier. My joy is full. His pleasure is my pleasure. His joy is my joy. And I'm sorry you guys never understood that. And if you promote me ahead of Jesus, don't do that. You actually reduce my joy. We're not going there. Well, then the baptizer ends with a stunning, soul-stirring statement that is one of the most famous statements of the Gospel of John. He must increase, but I must decrease. This statement I call a resolution. It's a resolve. It's so short. It's very powerful. And this is what John adopts as kind of a life mission. And so he's saying like this, I don't begrudgingly give way to Jesus like some guy who was arm wrestling and then finally have to succumb and cry uncle and stop off swearing. This is what I want. He must increase, I must decrease. I want him to win, and I want me to lose, if that helps him win. It is the whole will of God. And of course, this statement ended up getting him killed, but right now, it is the best thing you could ever hear. These are the final words that John says in this gospel. I call it the triumphal exit. If a preacher cannot find a sermon in John 3:30, he had to smash his pulpit for kindling and take up Mongolian macrame. That would be outer Mongolia in a yurt. Verse 30 is very simple. He literally says, that one, the way you call him, you won't name him, so I won't either. Just say that one must. Literally, it is necessary. Necessary for what? For getting his bride, for achieving God's great and glorious agenda for this planet, which at its core is the coronation of Jesus Christ. And so, that being the highest delight of heaven, why would you not want that to happen? A compelling divine necessity at the very heart of the Father's purpose for sending the Son, put in motion before the foundation of the world. So he must increase, grow in influence. Not all at once. It implies something that goes little by little. It's growing greater and greater. Greater and greater exaltation. Until, John might be thinking, until everybody was with Jesus and no one, including you guys, is with me. This is my joy because this is the Father's joy. But here's the other side. It's kind of like a teeter-totter. If he increases, then I'm going to have to decrease, be lowered, reduced in importance. It is necessary. It's necessary for what? For the increase of Jesus. Now, every disciple John holds on to is one less disciple for Jesus. Just think of it mathematically for a minute. But this decrease is not just mathematical. It's something as far as influence and importance and some other things in his life. Leads to a prison, leads to a chopping block. The process of decline. Well, here's John. He's the opening act. He humbly exits stage left once the headliner steps up to the mic. It's what they were both born for. Now, this had to be easy for John? No. It means flushing all that pride of being the latest and greatest rock star in the land. Multitudes of people of all levels of society flocked to him, hung on every word, got baptized when he told them to, publicly confess sins. John was a phenom. It would be extremely hard for any of us to let something like that go. But John did. And so, carried on the wave of this sheer to the brim joy of his master's preeminence, the baptizer embraces the risk of losing his very life. The supernatural joy that he has makes him fearless. So, with the zeal that you would expect from a real prophet, John will take on the palace of Herod because the tetrarch is sinful. He's incestually married. And at that point, John is arrested and his rock star world crumbles. Crowds, no more. This, in fact, happened probably just a few short weeks after what we read here. John's humble resolution in verse 30 took him all the way to the chopping block. And I'm not sure when he said, I must decrease, that he had any idea that that would mean losing his head. But you do know that. And that is why this paragraph is in our Bible. It teaches us that promoting yourself is a choice to withhold some of the rightful success and glory that belongs to Jesus only. But it also teaches you that demoting yourself and saying such things opens you up to a world of suffering. And if we read this right, in that we should rejoice. All right, so here's John. John the Baptist. He is the first great example in the New Testament of what allegiance to Christ is all about. The joy and the self-sacrifice, the agony and the ecstasy. In fact, if John, the greatest man born of woman up till that time, according to Jesus, and he was right, if he interprets his life in such humble, Christ-exalting, self-abasing terms, would that not be the same for us? I can't think of a reason to deny that. Can we please then learn from him how joy-busting ego, like that pushed the buttons of the disciples of John, can be replaced by ego-busting, Christ-increasing, self-decreasing joy like John's. More Jesus, less me. And so I want to summarize our 4 statements from John by turning them into 4 questions that you can use whenever you're being sucked into a conflict, when things are falling apart in your house, when your pride is rising to defend yourself, when you are tired of being second all the time, when you need to apologize but the words get stuck in your throat, and when your first impulse is anger, when you're fed up, you just want to dump out all your complaints in a rant, and hundreds of other things we could mention, many of which we mentioned at the beginning of the sermon. When those situations are going on, what do we do? And so I want to give you 4 questions that could come to mind. Use one or all that can derail joy-busting ego at such times. 4 questions. And each of them is meant to do 2 things. Well, let's say 3 things. 2 things. First of all, the question could humble your pride and ignite your joy. But those will not happen if a 3rd thing doesn't happen, and that is your eyes will have to go on Jesus Christ. Now, you think about it, you need both humility and joy. Now, we all want the joy part. We don't want the humility, but you got to have them both. Because if you just want the joy, what you're lacking is this. Humility is a settled conviction that you, as sinful as you are, as weak as you are, as finite as you are, do not deserve any joy. And whatever delight you have will be a gift of grace. Once you abandon that is, if you don't have humility, then you start thinking you deserve some happiness, maybe not infinite happiness, but a little more than I have. Then your pride monster will kick in and make sure that you never get enough to feel satisfied. You have to have them both. Now, neither one of them is a goal. They're not an end in themselves. It's not like we're just trying to be humble people. Or I just want great joy. All of that is self-focused. And neither one will happen as long as you are self-focused. So here is what happens. You see Jesus. And in his great presence, you can't help but be humble. And in his great presence, when you see him as he is, you cannot help but rejoice. And that is the whole purpose of this passage. And this is what's missing in our homes when they are destroyed and they crumble, because Jesus is not there in any large way. You understand where I'm going with this? Now, I want to give you these 4 questions, but I want you to keep your mind on that, and I'll try to keep it right there. Here's the first one, question number 1. You remember John's statement. You can't receive any good thing, not even one thing, unless heaven gives it to you. So, question 1, what do I have that I did not receive? As a gift from God. Now, this is Paul. This is 1 Corinthians 4:7, written to people who were prone to boast in themselves. 1 Corinthians 4:7 says, what do you have that you did not receive? And if then you received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? Or why complain if you don't like what you got? And then you think about the baptizer. You know, they want him to push himself forward because he doesn't feel like he deserves anything anyway. If he got anything, it was a gift of grace from God. It's totally up to God. And so that is what produces humility, because it requires you to admit that you did nothing to deserve even one breath on this planet, let alone some kind of ministry. And then you get ego-busting joy out of that because you know you did receive what you did not deserve. You see how they go together. I was trying to get my way out of the parking lot on Monday as I was thinking about this, and I had to stop. I could not even drive. I was thinking, I don't even deserve to be alive. I deserve to be in hell. I can't believe that God has even given me life. And it overwhelmed me to think of that. And so you're having a big argument about some little thing. You're like, who got more potatoes? Or, just pick any old little thing, because they're always little things. And you say, what is this about? Where is Jesus in all this? So what do I have that I did not receive? And why do I think I deserve anything more than what God has chosen for me? Just enough to make sure that Jesus gets exalted. That's all he needs to give you. But it is so hard to go there. So we have all this competition. Little girl comes home. Finally, she's In kindergarten, she gets to be a brownie. She says, I'm a brownie. And her little brother comes in, really? I'm a cupcake. So there you go. And life goes on from there. Competition in the family, siblings fighting over this and over that. So hard to step aside, let others get their way. Let others win the argument. Others take their jolly good time becoming as perfect as you need them to be. Takes faith. Takes faith to understand that God has given you all that you should be. You don't have to be something else. In fact, Jesus said, if you want to be first, then be the slave of all. James and John are fighting over who's the greatest and who gets to have the top seats in the kingdom. And Jesus said, wait a minute. If you want to be first, this is the way. Be the slave of all. In fact, even dying would be a good way to do that, because he says this, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Okay, so that's question number one. Question two is this. Remember, he said, remember that I told you I am not the Messiah, but I've been sent before him, ahead of him. So remember that. So here's the question. Who's the Messiah here anyway? So you're having this big argument at home, and I want you to think about the way you're acting. And let me give you another question that goes with this. I've used this in another sermon. Who needs to shine here anyway? And the answer is Christ. Who is the Messiah here? You don't want a bunch of messiahs running around. You might have read that story, the three Christs of Ypsilanti. And they put all the ones this is in the Saint Asylum where everybody thinks they're the Messianic, they think they're Napoleon or whatever. They put them all together. One says, God told me. And the other guy says, I did not. So in your house, that's what you have. You have all these pretend messiahs. In fact, the greatest thing about John the Baptizer is not the thousands he baptized, but that he never tried to be Jesus to anybody. So he gave us this great heritage of full joy in promoting and introducing Jesus as the all-worthy embodiment of all excellence to whom there is no possible competitor. So here's humility, realizing that it's ridiculous to do a takeover on the throne that belongs to Jesus. You're sitting on Christ's throne, get off. And then the joy will come when you let him be in charge. Let him be the good shepherd. Let him be the one that cares for your needs. You don't have to do that. You let him do that. That's where the joy comes from. Find ego-busting joy in the flat-out superiority of Christ and his ability to be the Messiah that you don't have to be. Here's number three. John used an analogy. Marriage. Here's the friend or the best man of the groom, who is Jesus. The groom is Jesus. So John's great to-the-brim joy was what? It's based on the joy of Jesus over his bride, which would be us. So here's question three. Is it not enough? Enough for what? Enough for all the joy and the satisfaction that you could ever need. And in fact, for everything you ever need. Is it not enough for me that Jesus rejoices over his bride, which includes me? So his rejoicing over me, his love of me. So here's where the humbling comes, because I realize I'm receiving a love I did not deserve. And I ask it like this. How could it make someone as amazing as Jesus happy that he got stuck with a schmuck like me? That's humbling. Like if I saw him, why would he take a second look at me? I'm not pretty enough. I'm not rich enough. I'm not talented enough. I'm not nice enough. By far not nice enough. But this is what all grace is all about, that saved a wretch like me. And so he marries us. And then here's where the joy comes from. He loves us. He delights in us. That's what this whole analogy was about. Look, I got to hear the voice of the groom. What? Delighting in his bride. And so here's the Lord delighting in his bride. So here we are, the recipients of that. So we find ego-busting joy in the pleasure of Christ over us, to be loved. Everything that Nate was preaching about last week, about the love of God for his people. And now here's the last one. The triumphal exit. He must increase, but I must decrease. And a fourth one, we ask this question. It involves a lot of risk, but here's the question. What limits have I placed? Because, this is tough territory. We don't want to go all the way here. But what limits have I placed on what God may demand of me for the glory of his Son? You get humility out of that because it forces you to consider the cost. of laying down your life, of taking up your cross, of ending up in a prison, of going the path of John the Baptist. But the upside-down joy of all that, you know that by decreasing, you increase him. Because you're not going to get more of Jesus until there's less of you. One preacher applied it like this. He said, you men, your testiness at home, your lack of a true daily interest in the happiness of your wives, your far too little engagement with your children at the level of their hearts and minds. What is that but far too much of you and far too little of Jesus Christ? Are you willing to lay your interests down, even acknowledge you're wrong before your wife to see Christ increase? Are you willing to become less and him to become greater in your life? You women, your spirit of complaint, your incessant desire for more, your critical spirit. Be entirely honest with yourselves. What is that but far too much of you and far too little of Jesus Christ? In how many ways and how many different ways would your life change, your attitudes, your behavior, your speech, if it were more the aspiration and the commitment and the determination of your life that you decrease so that Jesus might increase? But how much we fight that. How much we do not want to be less. I want to read you something I wrote for my dad for his 84th birthday. It's called The Stone Layer. My father was a master stone layer. His two strong hands built things of extraordinary beauty, walls and fireplaces and pillars and walkways and monuments. Many of his masterpieces were extremely large, much too large to be set in place by just two human hands, at least not all at once. He created these grand works by setting them in place piece by piece, stone by stone, brick by brick. Each piece by itself had to be small enough to lift. He knew exactly what he wanted to make, so he chose each piece carefully and handled each piece lovingly until it was placed in the precise spot where he knew it belonged. As a youth, I watched my father stoop over a pile of raw stones dumped out by the building materials truck, a chaotic jumble of loose rocks. Somehow in his craftsman's mind, he knew these could be transformed from useless rubble into a work of art and a credit to its creator. He alone knew what stone he needed for the next gap in the work. I saw him spread out the stones on the bare ground so he could see them better. And he would turn them end for end or upside down. I must admit I could never see what he saw in those random stones, not until they had been placed. But a gleam would lighten his face when he spotted what he was looking for, and he would see the perfect stone of the right general shape and color as it lay anonymously among its fellows. He saw beauty where I saw none. With a smile, my stone layer father would reach down and grip the stone tightly. He would lift it, and before he ministered to it with his trowel, he ministered to it with his hammer. Holding the stone in one hand, he would use his mason's hammer with its one iron claw to score a shallow groove, sometimes with the help of a chisel, and then hack off an end or an odd corner of that perfect stone. For not only did the stone need to be small enough to lift, it had to be small enough to fit. And that meant that, of necessity, the stone layer had also to be the stone breaker. My father reduced the perfect stone with a blow that left it diminished and useful. Each stone must be not what it is, but what the master knows it can be. For that to happen, my father had to break each stone with a controlled fury. He gathered his wise strength and he struck a savage blow, sometimes more than one if the stone was stubborn. And then he would smear mortar or mud to its broken sides, slide it into place, and then hit it again with the butt of his trowel until it was exactly where he wanted it. And then he would stand back and admire that stone and begin the search for a fitting companion. Years later, when I was grown, I decided to try my own hand at laying some stones, actually bricks in this case. And what I discovered all too soon is that the beginner's blow upon the brick can easily be too hard or too soft. The fury must be tuned to the particular piece that must be broken. Too hard and it will shatter into useless fragments. Too soft and the blow must be needlessly repeated. If a stone could feel and think, this process would certainly be a problem for the stone. For what stone really desires to be less? What stone in its right mind voluntarily seeks smallness at the cost of painful blows and being knocked about into a new shape and shoved into a tight place covered half in mud. Each stone wants to be that one stone that fit perfectly without being clobbered, that has an honored place in the wall without being even slightly trimmed, that has strengths with no downsides and no weaknesses at all. Not I. Don't strike me, Master. You might lop off some part of me that I find really precious, something I'm sure I can't live without, something that makes me me. Not I. Surely I don't need to be reduced. At the end of my father's project, there was always a pile of useless fragments that had been splintered off the many stones now part of the grand masterpiece. But among them would also lie 2 or 3 unbroken stones that were too stubborn to be diminished and fitted. And they would then be bulldozed and buried with the rubble when the building site was graded, their beauty lost to the maker because of their hardness. Oh, that they had known the heart of the stone layer, that the breaking was always done with tender grace. Little did they know that the fury of the breaking was not one bit more or less than was needed to make each stone useful and outrageously beautiful. When I tried laying some stone myself, I discovered something that could not be known by mere watching. I learned that a stone layer must hold the stone tightly in his hand and yet somehow softly. It takes immense hand strength to hold tightly, but not too tightly. There had to be subtle tenderness to this fierce violence, born of care and precision and a determination that not one stone be lost. The stone lies sandwiched between hammer of steel and hand of flesh so that the master can remove what the stone didn't need anyway. He does this at immediate danger to himself because he must cushion each blow to the stone by his own hand. And when the stone breaks, the hammer invariably impacts the stone layer's own hand. Sometimes the claw cuts quickly through the stone and pierces his flesh, drawing blood, not the blood of the stone, but the stone layer. My father's hands were scarred and calloused, the unavoidable result of making those stones into something of beauty. He held each stone as a baby he loved. He placed each one with pride like watching a graduation. But every stone so blessed cost him something. My father would return home tired after a long day of creating beauty for others, and there he would find my invalid mother. He would spend the evening caring for her, tending to the dinner, the dishes, and the house. Night after night for 20 years and more, he would take those same scarred hands and cover them with lotion. Then he would rub my mother's aching limbs so she could sleep. Such is the tenderness of the stone layer's hands and his heart. And it's so difficult for me to endure loss as the necessary prerequisite to taking the special place the Master has wisely chosen for me. We are all naturally too big for our own niches. It's a bit daunting to get a heart for God's end of the hammer. But the truth is, in God's building, his living temple, every stone is strategically diminished so it can call attention and draw the eye toward the stone of honor, Jesus Christ. He must increase, but I must decrease. Can I live with that? Can I live with the fact that I seem to get all the furious whacking and losses so that he can get all the glory? Can I understand that he took the fatal and fiercest blows on himself? And that's why it is he that is so honored, because of his blood. And occasionally the only stone with the right face for a little but necessary niche must be almost completely hacked away so that the master can use that one perfect edge to adorn the work. Can such a stone be content that it has not lost anything that it really needed? I'm crushed, you complain. No, you're changed. I'm ruined. No, you're rescued. I'm a mess. No, you're a message. I'm too small now. No, maybe you're still not small enough. What will it take for me to say and mean, really mean, for him to increase? I must decrease. There can never be one without the other. Let's pray. It's time to practice what John preached. And by the way, we will never do this until we're convinced that the glory of Jesus is of infinitely greater importance than anything to do with me. And so let us pray. Father of our Lord Jesus, grant us victory in this battle against bitterness against miserable pride. Not that we may simply be happy or that we may pride ourselves for being so humble, but that we may be vanquished by true glory and laid in joyful lowliness before the cross of his love. Our zeal and our craving is to see him in glorious beauty, and so we may love and adore him as you do. We accept your answer to this prayer as a sovereign gift from your grace. In his glorious name, amen.